What's up, everybody? In today's video, we've got a surprise lens release from Canon. I want to compare it against its L counterpart. We've also got news about a super high resolution sensor from Canon and potentially more specs on this new APS-C cinema camera. So first, just an interesting announcement from Canon. They've announced that they've developed a 400 plus megapixel full frame 35mm sensor. Now I know there's a lot of people out there who've been hoping for an R5S or an R5R, but that's not this. Previously, the highest megapixel rated full frame or large format sensor that Canon was able to produce was 250 megapixels. And so right now, I think they're just kind of flexing. And they're doing it in two ways. But this isn't the first time that they've been able to pack pixels like this at this size. But now they've been able to expand the area to a full 35mm sensor. Previously, the APS-H sensor size was the one that they were using to kind of announce these super high resolution options. One of the things that they're pushing a lot more of is things like CCTV security and kind of real-time analysis. As well as their lithography system. I talked in a video just last week about the fact that they are investing heavily in their lithography technology, which is how you produce chips, and those chips can be camera sensors. So technically this would be considered a 24K sensor, right? It's 24,000 by 16,000 pixels. It does come in both a color and black and white variant, but it can also pull the entire sensor 8 times per second. That's the equivalent of pulling 70 plus frames per second off of something like the R5 with its 45 megapixel capacity, which is currently the largest, highest resolution consumer sensor Canon makes in their cameras. Why you would need resolution this high? Probably facial recognition, object recognition, and AI workloads to be able to ingest this information and use it to identify things quickly. But no, we will likely not be seeing this particular sensor in a EOS camera anytime soon. But speaking of EOS cameras, we just got a new lens that I don't know that a lot of people were expecting. Once you look at the specs, it's kind of interesting. Now, I pulled out my 14 to 35 f4L as a comparison. And you might say, well, Joe, this isn't an L lens, and that one's 16 to 28, whereas this one's 14 to 35, right? They're totally different lenses, except that right now, this one's only $150 more. It's priced at $1149. But there are definitely some pros and cons for going with the STM version versus something like this in an L variant. It really just depends on what you're shooting. So I wanted to compare these two lenses because of the fact that they are pretty much kind of the closest in price in the Canon lineup for the RF system. But looking at this new lens on paper, you might say, well, this looks like it checks a lot of boxes. It is 16 to 28 millimeters, so it handles your kind of super wide zoom, and it zooms in to 28, which isn't terrible. It's not as far as, say, 35. And unlike the 15 to 30 STM lens, it has a fixed aperture of f2.8. It also has a minimum focusing distance of about 8 inches, which is about the same as this lens. It also has weather sealing, though not specifically on the rings and buttons, so it isn't as weather sealed as what you would see in an L lens like this. And in most L lenses, you get the USM or ultrasonic motors, like you will in this lens, whereas in the 16 to 28, you're going to be getting the STM or the stepping motors. These motors can be a little bit slower, a little bit less accurate, and they can also be a little bit noisier. Although from every report that I've seen, no one has complained about the sound that you get out of this lens. It has image stabilization up to 5.5 stops, just like this lens, and when paired with a Canon sensor that has built-in image stabilization, you will be able to get up to 8.5 stops in the center of the frame and 7.5 stops in the periphery. It has a 67mm filter thread, and this new lens is 445 grams. Now, I love this super wide L lens specifically because of the fact that it's very light, but it is 100 grams more. So on paper, it looks like the 16 to 28 is an ultra wide, super light travel lens that has some of the weather sealing of an L lens, the image stabilization that you get out of a much more expensive lens, and a constant f2.8 aperture. No brainer, right? But now let's really talk about the things that you're giving up beyond switching from the USM to the STM motor. So first, let's talk about coatings. One of the things that differentiates a lot of the older L lenses in Canon's lineup from the newer RF lenses is that the coatings on their glass have improved significantly. And those coatings do things to reduce flaring and chromatic aberration. And that just means that there's less work for you to do in post and that the images come out of camera cleaner, sharper, and it allows you to shoot in more varied environments like into light sources. Depending on the type of photography that you're doing, it might be a big deal if you end up with a lot more flaring or a lot less control over the color cast or aberration that you have in your lens. The other is the actual glass components in the lens. So a lens like this has 3 aspherical elements and 3 UD or ultra low dispersion elements. Again, these are pieces of glass that help to improve the quality of the image, reduce aberration, and help the light come together properly when it hits the sensor. But it also has 1 aspherical ultra low dispersion element. The new lens has 4 UD elements and 2 aspherical elements. So it's missing that ultra low dispersion element that is also aspherical. And while it does come with the super spectra coating, an L lens would come with a sub-wavelength structure coating, an air sphere coating, and a fluorine coating on the front element, which this new lens doesn't have. Now I mentioned that the new lens is partially weather sealed, but doesn't have seals on the switches and buttons or the rings. It's also missing a ring. This lens has a zoom ring, a focus ring, and a control ring, whereas that lens only has the 2. So while it does have a control ring and you can choose whether or not you want that to be the control ring or the focus ring, you only have the 1 option. The other thing that you don't have, that you would have on an L lens, is the stabilizer switch. That is also not included on the lens, which I guess kind of reduces the number of potential ingress points for dust and water, but if you need those, they're not there. The new 16mm lens absolutely has the same 9-blade aperture as a lens like this and most of the lenses in the L series. And the bokeh images that I've seen from other creators have actually been quite good. Very little onion ringing and very little cat eye. So that brings me to kind of the last comparison that I want to make. And I want to dig deep into the kind of camera nerdery that happens when you're talking about the specifics of a lens. So it's super common, and I don't have a problem with it, that Canon is using profile correction on pretty much every lens that they make. They've put lots and lots of tech inside their cameras, and that should make your image better. And if that means that your camera does a better job at adapting to your lens, well, then more power to us, right? That also allows Canon to do some different things with lenses that maybe they haven't done in the past. Maybe certain designs wouldn't have made it to production if they didn't have some of this correction happening after the lens is attached. It's also not uncommon for some of the specs that we get on these lenses to not exactly be what they are. They fudge the numbers just a little bit. There's some rounding going on. For example, this lens is a 14mm lens. Or is it? The patent application actually says that it's a 14.8mm lens. It's almost 15, and it's supposed to go all the way to 35, but actually it really only goes up to about 33. The aperture is supposed to be a locked-in f4, but actually it's f4.1, and at the longest end, which is again about 32 to 33 millimeters, it's actually 4.5. But not unlike that bottle of I can't believe it's not butter 0-calorie spray that you may or may not have in your fridge, or that packet of Splenda that says that it's 0 calories, but it's not. They round a little bit, and it's okay. Nobody really has a problem with that. So this 16 to 28 millimeter is a 15.7 to 27 millimeter. And instead of f2.8, it's f2.9. But really, it's a rounding error. Who really cares? Except that there's one number that I'm a little concerned about. And I told you that this was gonna be some camera nerdery, so I appreciate it if you hang on while we do this math. So this lens has what's called an image circle, right? The back of this is a circle. The front of it is a circle. The image that comes out of it is a circle. But the sensor is a rectangle. It's a 2x3 rectangle. It's 36 millimeters on the top and it's 24 millimeters on the side. But we call it a 35 millimeter sensor. Again, we're doing some rounding. It's okay. Well, the circle that comes out of the back of your lens has to be big enough to cover the entire sensor, right? And the way that they describe that in the design of a lens is by calling it the height of the image, which is really just the radius. But if you remember back to math class, the way that you figure out the diameter or the width of a circle is to double the radius. So the radius of the image circle of pretty much every lens that you see that is full frame is a little over 21 millimeters. Well, if you double that, you get 42 millimeters. And that's normal. And the reason that that's the case is because the sensor is a rectangle. And you need that overlap to make sure that you go around the corners. You need at least 21 millimeters to be able to completely encompass a full frame sensor. And that's why, again, if you look at pretty much every single patent application or specs that you see for full frame lenses, they're 20 millimeters. That's really a number that lens designers have to hit. You have to have 21 plus millimeters to be able to encompass the full sensor. Until we look at this new lens. Because pretty much throughout the zoom range, it's less, 20 and a half, so it's almost there. But at its widest, it's 17 and a half, which means that the image circle isn't going to encompass the entire sensor. Now, you're not gonna see this really on your image. It's going to be corrected using profile correction. The way that it does that is effectively by zooming in, which means that technically you get less resolution and you don't get as wide a field of view. While I'm fine with really Canon or any other lens manufacturer kind of doing some rounding on some of those numbers, and I have no problem with most profile correction to improve things like slightly darker vignetting in the corners, improving distortion, chromatic aberration, even flaring in camera, I don't know how I feel about the fact that this lens doesn't really even cover the sensor. Which brings me to my last point. At $1,149, on paper, it looks very good. It's got a great zoom range, it's super wide, it's image stabilized, it's partially weather sealed, and it's got a constant aperture of f2.8, which would make spending the extra $150 worth it for something like this, where you get an additional 2 millimeters at the wide end, 7 millimeters at the long end, the USM motors, the fully sealed body with the additional controls, and the additional button, the better coatings, and the larger filter thread. But you do give up one stop of light, and you do add 100 grams to your kit. So that's a decision that you have to make, but that would be my recommendation. Personally, I love this lens, and this new lens does not really give me any kind of pause. Okay, the last bit of Canon news that we have, and I talked about this in a previous video where we said we think that there's a cinema camera coming. Now we have specs for a new camera that is a APS-C camera. We don't know if it's specifically a cinema camera, but looking at these specs, it's either a cinema camera or it's just a super cool APS-C camera because dang, at 24 megapixels stacked on that sensor, 6K RAW on that sensor, 4K up to 120, 1080 up to 240, 30 frame per second still shooting, the Digic X with the Digic accelerator chip. So right now we're basically describing the R1, but in an APS-C camera, as well as a new body design, although the rumor that I've been hearing is that it would be similar to the EOS M style cameras, maybe to confront Sony on the FX30 and the A6700 or the ZVE10. Coming with C-Log 2 and C-Log 3, which means you could potentially use this as a B camera, a full-size HDMI port, though we don't know what it would be outputting necessarily, and costing less than $1,500. This information is either real and about the absolute coolest Super 35 style mini body cinema camera that Canon has ever made, or it's just a pipe dream. And I'll be real honest, these feel a little too good to be true, but let's see what we get. But this isn't the R6 III. This isn't, I guess this could be potentially an update to the R7, but I don't see them going down in megapixels. I don't know, no mention of IS. I really do feel like this is gonna be a cinema Super 35 crop sensor camera to compete with Sony. At least that's my hope. Pair this with some of those new hybrid lenses, or this new lens that they just came out with. And I think that that would be an interesting combo. Let me know what you think about that down in the comments. That's it for the Canon news that we have for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget about my Instagram giveaway. Go ahead and click on, don't forget about my Instagram giveaway. Go ahead and check out this video right here. I've got a link up here and a link down below to my Instagram and to the video for you to get free gear out of my gear vault. Last but not least, I'm opening up memberships here in the channel where I'll be giving away LUTs, Lightroom presets, other resources, and be doing lives and chats for members. Go ahead and check that out down below. That's another way that you can support the channel. A free way that you can support the channel is just by hitting the subscribe button, hitting the like button, letting me know that you thought that this video was interesting and informative. But that's it for me, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks, bye.